To be a very exciting webinar. I'm very pleased to have an interesting round of panelists. Today we'll have a joint webinar together with the dataskit.net, represented by Amelia Andersdotter. And we will start with a short introduction by Kelsey Finch before we move on to the rest of the program. So Kelsey, it's up for you first. Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to share. Hopefully folks can see this quick slide just to say welcome on behalf of the Future of Privacy Forum. We are really excited to have you here today for this program on privacy and high density crowd contacts, talking about privacy recommendations in smart city and network procurement. We're joined by a fantastic panel of experts today. And just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the Future of Privacy Forum. So for folks who don't know us, we are a independent, nonpartisan privacy nonprofit. Our focus is on bridging gaps between policymakers, industry, academics, and civil society in privacy policy, and to develop privacy protections, ethical norms, and responsible data practices across many sectors. We're supported by companies, academics, civil society, and foundations, and work in a variety of work streams that pull us together today. So really excited to be able to highlight the expertise of the folks on this call and to be able to join you all in conversation. And with that, happy to hand it back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yes, I would actually not do just by a short introduction of our panelists. So I'll briefly call out their names and their affiliations, and then we will move towards the first presentation. So very, very happy to have Amelia Andersdotter here of dataskit.net, but also Jelena Burnik, who is now the head of International Cooperation and Enforcement at the Information Commissioner of the Republic of Slovenia. Also Marit Hansen, the State Commissioner for Data Protection of Schleswig-Holstein. Udo Uhlen, who is now a Chief Privacy Officer at Dutch Railways, but he used to be the head of private sector at the Dutch Data Protection Authority. We have Rome Henry from Cisco, but also Tiago Rodriguez from the Wireless Broadband Alliance. And to basically kick off this interesting discussion on Wi-Fi technology and procurement of equipment for Wi-Fi technologies, I'd first like to hand the mic to Amelia Andersdotter to help us kickstart the discussion today. Amelia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will try to find the right screen to share. Here. And you should now be seeing my slides, if I'm not mistaken. I see some nodding. Very well. So my name is Amelia Andersdotter. I come from dataskit.net. It's a Swedish NGO with a privacy focus. I'll be speaking very briefly on the role of privacy preserving technologies in smart city networks and network procurement. So we're living in a time of increasingly ubiquitous connectivity. We have investments in smart cities, smart buildings, smart infrastructure, and lots of devices that surround us in our daily lives communicate with each other. They collect data about private individuals. They share data between themselves. Data gets aggregated in big data centers where it's processed, hopefully with a view to enabling devices to be ever more helpful to us in our daily activities. But all of this data collection and the data exchange, as well as its processing, also means larger privacy concerns. So in particular, the issues which are raised with these ubiquitous smart infrastructures that surround us concern transparency. So is it possible for individuals to fathom or understand what is going on in the infrastructures around them? Is there foreseeability? Are we able to foresee the consequences of all of these big data processing activities and what they might mean, not only for us as private individuals, but also for our human communities and the way that we interact with one another? And thirdly, is there an ability to opt out? What happens if you're an individual that does not want to share your data, or that does not want your data processed by a particular entity, or that does not trust a particular government authority or company with the management of your daily activities? So these are some of the strong privacy concerns that arise when we surround ourselves by more and more networked technologies. So a bit about myself, though, and why I'm interested in these questions. Well, I worked in the European Parliament between 2011 and 2014 as a member of the European Parliament representing the Swedish Pirate Party. One of the activities that I undertook was working on the General Data Protection Regulation, but I also worked on telecommunications and network issues and followed them very closely, like the regulation of our network infrastructure providers, as well as on electronic identification and trust services, which of course concerned the core of how we authenticate users in Europe. Now, DataSkydd.net was a project I started with a friend, ostensibly to make privacy-preserving web technologies. Actually, we have a tool for how you can privacy check your website. But we also followed the Swedish implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation between 2005 and 2016. So I followed very extensively the way that specifically government authorities reason about data collection, both ubiquitously from networked equipment, but also from their own infrastructure in terms of like big servers and how they treat citizen data and citizen involvement in decisions about data. Beyond that, I worked with consumer rights and privacy in India for a while in 2016. It was a very rewarding experience to see how privacy issues and high technological infrastructures are dealt with in a completely different jurisdiction from the one where I had worked before. But the reason that we're here in this webinar, perhaps, and this webinar comes as a continuation of some of the work I did between 2017 and 2019, and that I know Jerome will talk about later, was on technical standards and privacy rights with Article 19, a London-based human rights organization that for the past 6 years has been running a program on how technical design choices in standardization impact the ability of individuals to exercise their human rights. So the good news from my work at Article 19 and what I observed in the standardization bodies where I participated is that many industry-driven standards bodies are working very hard on improving the general privacy qualities of both network infrastructures and web infrastructures. So we have a lot of engineers and a lot of companies putting in a lot of engineering hours into thinking about what design flaws exist in the technologies today that could be remedied by various measures in order to facilitate transparency, foreseeability, and an ability to opt out. So basically give individuals better tools to make decisions about the way that they can interact with technical infrastructure. One of the examples of this is here from the Internet Engineering Task Force that is responsible more or less for the bulk of what you see in a web browser or in an emailing client. RFC 6973 concerns privacy recommendations for Internet protocol developments. I know Marit Hansen was instrumental in getting that RFC eventually sorted, but it's now led to more than 60 derivative works and real consequences on real Internet standards that we all are using in our daily lives when we use email, web, any other kind of protocol, FTP, what have you. It's basically impacted by these privacy considerations. And so another example of how industry is focusing on privacy comes from the 3GPP, or the Third Generation Partnership Project, which is broadly responsible for mobile network standardization. You see here some excerpts from their document repository, where indeed there's almost 1,500 contributions that come up in a quick search with privacy only in the title of the presentation. And so also in mobile networks, we have a lot of engineers that are thinking about how can we deal with identifiers, how can we make sure that that transparency, foreseeability, and an ability to opt out is accessible to consumers as they use these new network technologies. In particular, the focus of technical standards bodies at the level where I've been working at is on stronger encryption, data, like encrypting any data which is either in storage or in transit. Data minimization, so ensuring that protocols and different networking features do not generate identifiers or identifiable information beyond what is necessary. Proportionality, ensuring that the service which is meant to be provided by a particular technology is provided with the minimal amount of data that you need. But also, and this is very interesting and I worked on a lot, storage minimization in terms of temporary pseudonyms. Is there a way that you can make communication in the network happen by using only a transient identifier that does not allow systematic correlation of individual behaviors over time with a view to manipulating those behaviors? And if there's any listeners in the audience who've been familiar with artificial intelligence discussions and these sort of reasoning on ethics, then for sure, temporary pseudonyms and allowing people to be contextually in the place where they are, but not have that context shifted around between a bunch of different locations. This is indeed a very important privacy feature of smart systems. So all of these different properties are in one way or the other being introduced or implemented in web, internet, and networking standards. And I find it personally very hopeful. But the question that we have today is there really a demand? And as industry is embarking on all of these privacy enhancing technology developments, are they reaping any rewards from reorienting towards more robust privacy standards? I think this is an open question, which I hope that we will be delving into more in the panel. But the challenges include, for widespread adoption, conflicting policy goals. Certainly we see some of them now with Corona, tracing, geolocational privacy and network technologies. There's a lack of awareness of privacy standards, perhaps, with those people who are best placed to create such a demand or have such a demand. But what I want to speak a bit more about is, especially in the European context, a bit of a weak interface between industry-driven standards bodies like the IETF, like the 3GPP, or as we will hear later, the IEEE, and the European level policymaking. So what do I mean by that? Well, so the European Union has a system for values-based standardization, namely ensuring that the values that are enshrined in European laws are also enacted in technologies through technical standards. The primary vehicle for this standardization is the new approach. It emerged in the 1980s to allow member state national standards bodies to harmonize their already existing national standards in a European level harmonized standard. So kind of like something that brings all of the national qualities together and ensures that products which are certified in one member state can also be sold or put on the market in a different member state. And this works extremely well in slow-moving industries where there are already standards relatively fixed at the national level. You'd imagine things like steel pipes or the thickness of the inner lining of, the sewer pipe that drains your toilet, this kind of thing. All of these things have been standardized in the member states, and because of the new approach in European standard system, you can now sell, toilet sewer pipes between the different member states. But where the new approach really has still some way to cover is in rapid innovation environments, such as information and communication technologies. And this is because in ICTs, whether it be on the network level or the web level of our information environment, innovation may happen through standardization rather than post hoc. So this means that before an innovation is even launched onto the market, it is already standardized because the actors in these network markets really value interoperability. And there is simply no space for creating small national solutions before you go global, as it were. So one very telling example of this, or at least I find, is the interaction between accessibility standards and the European new approach. So accessibility, of course, in a website sense means that, you think about the size of the buttons or the size of the text, and making your website accessible to text-to-speech readers to facilitate for people with either seeing difficulties or dyslexia, or maybe Parkinson if your hand is shaking a lot so you can't hit a button easily. This is a large priority for the European Union, and it's been in European Union law for at least 20 years that member states should try to emphasize in the web environment having some form of accessibility requirements on at least public sector websites. So there is a web accessibility standard, the WCAG 2.0, which was adopted by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, in 2004. The W3C is an industry-driven consortium made by interested parties. Many of them are very large in the web industry. They may be advertisers or browser manufacturers, these types of entities, also academic institutions. And so it's been around for a while, actually. The WCAG 2.0, accessibility has always been a strong focus of in web development, because of course a lot of people have these problems with not seeing well or not being able to read well, and so it's commercially interesting as well as just humane to treat everyone decently online. Now, the main elements of the WCAG 2.0 is incorporated in the Web Accessibility Directive of the European Union from 2016. And that's all well and fine, and the public sector in the European Union is starting to emphasize accessibility when they procure new websites, but it's 12 years after the initial industry adoption of this standard. Also, creating a European level directive in order to increase adoption of an industry developed standard is a very large machinery that involves a lot of actors. And for sure, the standard adopted by industry is more specific and more easy to implement than the somewhat politically more vague descriptions that sometimes get inserted into European law. Now, only after the directive was passed was there scope for the European Commission to start the process of seeking a harmonized standard under the new approach. So that means we're still working in the European Union to have these accessibility standards for the web, ensuring that the public sector can make adequate demands of website developers when it comes to making their websites accessible to people with reading difficulties that don't have perfect eyesight, or that may suffer other types of immobility issues such as Parkinson. So that's a very long time to be working on an industry-driven standard before you see any concrete benefit for the European citizen. And we would like for the adoption actually of privacy enhancing standards to be quicker. We're hoping that the moral leadership that's been shown by the European Commission and the member states on data protection issues will seep into public procurement and industry-driven standards bodies more quickly than has been the case for accessibility. And indeed, that is also somehow the case, as I previously demonstrated with some of these industry-driven initiatives. But there are some open questions that remain, and that we'll get back to, I suppose, later in this webinar, which is there a demand for these privacy enhancing standards? So when we have the legislation in place, when there is sort of a direction for the European Union, is that a sufficient lever for creating demand? And if it is, and even if it isn't, who could or should create that demand? Is this a responsibility that remains with people that do procurement, or is it something where data protection authorities need to step up? Is it something where the European Union needs to reassess its standardization approach more broadly? And just as a third question, which is, I mean, impossibly broad, but also I think very to the point, how do we ensure that Europe reaps the benefit of its leadership in data protection? Now, if we have industry actors stepping up, how do we ensure that they are rewarded appropriately for their commitment? And how can we also ensure that the European Union citizens get these infrastructures that at least ostensibly uphold the values that their legislators tell them apply on this territory? And so that was what I had planned to say initially, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of these 2 hours. Thank you so much, Rob, for facilitating this discussion.
Thank you, Emilia, for this great introduction. It's very intriguing because, like you say, there are a number of different standardization groups working on privacy in standards. And you mentioned IEEE, the IETF, there's the W3C, 3GPP, but you also have like ISO, and the two names you did not mention but were in your slides are the CEN-CENELEC and also the ETSI. This shows that standardization is, of course, not just a European issue. It's plays on the global level, and it's very interesting to see. So my first question, because we're going to open up for a short Q&A before we dive into the presentation by Henry, to open the Q&A, and you can all put your questions in the chat, please, if you want to. My first question to you to open up this Q&A is, a lot of the work is actually being done within these various standardization bodies. Do you see a need for these bodies to cooperate, or do you maybe see that there's more a need to promote or to valorize the results of these standardization efforts more towards governing bodies like the EU? So there's more like, is there a benefit in increasing or a horizontal level in between governance bodies, the work on privacy protocols, or should we perhaps focus more on how do we make sure this gets implemented?
So, of course, some of the people who are in the panel will have larger experience of both government-driven standards bodies and industry-driven standards bodies than myself. But at least my short experience working with Article 19 was that there is already extensive contact between different standards organizations when it comes, whether it be around developing privacy preserving mechanisms or others. And so when we were working on temporary identifiers in the IEEE 802.11, which does wireless local area network technologies, we interacted with the Wireless Broadband Alliance, but we also interacted with, you know, the 3GPP and the mobile sector. I think where there's a larger challenge is in these bodies that you bring up, ETSI, ISO, SENS, and ELEC, that start their standardization initiatives only after being given a political mandate. So that creates a quite large responsibility on you know, governance bodies that are not industry driven to follow through on previous decisions. We can, of course, say that we believe industry is not trying to valorize on privacy enough. I don't think that this is true necessarily. Like many of these standardization efforts that are happening in industry-driven standards bodies are, in fact, motivated by the perception of a commercial demand. And so I don't really where I see the strongest problems at this time, or the challenges to be overcome, is in the less technical governance area. So for instance, knowing that there are technical standards that you can use to make a more privacy preserving infrastructure, knowing about what requirements that you should ask from implementers or vendors of equipment when you're trying to build a new infrastructure. And so that's where I see the challenges more than in the horizontal interaction between, you know, industry-driven bodies.
Okay, thank you. Second question would be, and this is almost also maybe a little bit of a bridging question towards the work of Henry. Why the focus on the IEEE now? What's so important that we are discussing the P802E today? Amelia?
Well, I don't know if Jerome wants to add also, but one of the reasons to focus on it is that it's adopted and it will be made available to the public for reading and guidance within the upcoming few months. So I'm very happy about that. I think it's a great step forward.
Fantastic. I do a quick scan in the room. If there are any questions that may have triggered by the presentation of Amelia. And if not, I'd like to give the floor to Jerome for the presentation.
I actually see one in the Q&A.
Yes.
Asking what roles do we think civil society organizations can play in working to enhance privacy and standardization? So for example, organizations for persons with a certain disability or other consumer organizations.
Yeah, so I can make, because I come from a civil society organization that worked for enhancing privacy and in standardization, I can try to provide at least my limited view of this. Certain disability or consumer organizations in the European Union have a legal right to be represented in some standardization processes, namely the ETSI and SENS and ELEC ones, as well as ISO. And so there is a structure in place for providing these organizations with funding to participate in formal standardization bodies that are government driven. But because of the aforementioned governance problems in these organizations, or challenges to be overcome by mostly policy-oriented institutions, it may not be the forefront of development for either disability or consumer organizations. And so you would ask, how do you then ensure that these civil society groups can participate in the industry-driven standard bodies where a lot of the real stuff is going down? And that's by grants funding. So the way that my work was financed was by large government donors in particular that funded this program for not only me, but also a bunch of other individuals that mapped out a range of different, different layers of the internet infrastructure. And so that's one possible way of ensuring greater representation, that you look beyond formal structures and see if there's funding for participation. But participation in standardization is time consuming, and it's also expensive. And so Jerome is smiling now because we've actually collaborated already for 2.5 years to get these privacy recommendations finally, on the table for people to make use of. And so when you're embarking or thinking about how to embark on following these processes, both you and whoever is funding your participation needs to be aware that even if a lot of things are going on, it's still a fairly slow game.
Excellent. That's a great bridge towards the presentation by Irion. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, I'm smiling. I'll tell you why in a second. So before a quick introduction, so my name is Jerome Henry. I'm a researcher here at Cisco Systems in the US. I report to a chief technical officer for wireless. But also I'm what they call a senior member in the IEEE 802.11 group, which is a good illustration of what Emilia was describing about standardization. And the IEEE is maybe something which is a little bit complicated. It's the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. What we do is that we define standards and protocol. And I know, Rob, you mentioned the IEEE, the IETF, 3GPP, and quite a few others. So it may be a little bit difficult to know where all of these fit. Essentially, the 3GPP would be the organization of engineers that will help design your cellular communication, your 4G, your 5G. The IEEE designs protocols along multiple things, but in the 802 group, which was formed in 1980, we work around communications between electronic systems. So in this illustration, for example, every time your tablet or your phone communicates with what we call your Wi-Fi router, the IEEE, the 802 group designs how the radio waves can be transmitted and what they should be carrying to help mean communication between these devices. So we operate in a few fields for which you have names that you may know, like Bluetooth, like Zigbee, so of course Wi-Fi, WiMAX, etc. So that's essentially what the IEEE does. So we're an organization of engineers. It's a non-profit structure with thousands of engineers coming from all over the planet, working for corporations like myself, but also academia, governments, and more, who get together to try to define those protocols. And of course, it is not easy, right? 5G, for example, which was defined by the sister organization 3GPP, took 10 years in the making. 802.11 Wi-Fi has a new protocol variation and amendment every 3 to 5 years. So it's a long tail process because there is a lot of technical complexity, but also we need to ensure compatibility with all sorts of systems and of course regulations. So when we say that we design communications protocols, we only look at those I was describing. So that radio wave, what kind of energy is being sent there. When you are in the office and you connect a cable into your laptop, what kind of electric pulse is sent there, or radio light signal if it's a optical system, and then how does these signals mean zeros and ones? That's what we do. as soon as this communication happens and you start exchanging with, as Emilia was describing, a web server, and other organizations describe what you should say or should not say to that web server. So that's, for example, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. So we work at that raw communication level. And of course, for us, just like for the others, in the 2010 decade, with the event, as Rob was describing, of machine learning and fingerprinting, it became more and more obvious that our communication systems could be used for more than just communication. And this was new for us, just like it was for the others, because we designed protocols where essentially we offer services. For example, when you connect to your Wi-Fi router, you may have a tablet, your children may have a tablet. So these two devices are going to ask something from your Wi-Fi router. The router needs to know who is asking what to be able to provide that service. And that's the foundation on which all these protocols have been designed for the last 40 years. But in the decade 2010, it became more and more obvious that systems and organizations and structures could abuse that communication system to fingerprint and violate privacy of the users. So by the mid of the decade in 2015, we started looking into this P802E project, which is to say, let's go back into all these protocols that we have designed and see if we can have a way to assess what kind of privacy issue might be underlying into the way those protocols were designed. So that work started in 2015, and as Emil said, it's a long-run thing. Now, 5 years after, this work is almost complete, because there are a few publication details to go about, but it's for us to look at those and come up with some view on what privacy could be underlying in those protocols. So this is difficult also because privacy, as we'll discuss further here, has multiple meaning. It depends very much on which environment you are, which context you are in. And in the context of 802, there are a lot of contexts as well. If you're connected with a cable to your office, communication system, it's a very different environment than if you are doing some private browsing in airports or in your home. Those environments have very different contextual idea of what could be private and not private. So in this practice that we've designed, we're not really defining privacy because it's well defined everywhere else. And again, it's very contextual. But we do note that there are two underlying issues in our communication standards, one that we call the PIIs and the other that we call the PCI. And I'll come back on this definition in a second, but the consequence of that assessment is that we wanted to define how data was actually processed when it's private data, when it's personal data. How is it processed by these protocols, and what kind of exposure to privacy those protocols might have. So PII, personal, what that is what we call PII, which is personally identifiable information. This is any information you send, or your device, your tablet, your phone, your laptop sends, that can be used to uniquely identify that device. And in some context, uniquely identifying that device is also uniquely identifying you as a user. So of course, if you are in your home and there are like 5 devices in your home, what you're doing on your device may be unique to you, your role, in that family cell. Of course, if there are thousands of individuals in an airport, that personal identification may be more complex. But there may be traces that may be used to uniquely identify this device. And if you're the unique user of that device, then of course it can be identifying you. And once that's done, there is a continuity of that communication that can happen as you move about, as you travel back and forth and come back, maybe days after, to the same airport, where we can use what we call personally correlated information, which is those same traces that we identified initially as being uniquely you. We recognize them. And as we recognize them, we know it's still you, even if you're changing your identity just by the way your tablet or your phone is asking questions, or the kind of questions it's expressing, that might be sufficient to continually track you. And of course, it depends very much on the device, right? And in these protocols, we design as much for the enterprise, the factory, the public space, as for the personal device. So we had to distinguish something that we hadn't distinguished before, which is what we call first a personal device. That's again your tablet, that's your phone. It's something that very small amount of people are using. And that means that if we identify that thing, we can pretty much also identify you behind that thing. So it's obvious when it's a device you carry, right? But it can also be something that is providing a service, what we call the infrastructure. For example, the access points or the Wi-Fi router in your home. If there are only you or a few people using that device, identifying the traffic of that device is going to be very close to identifying what you are doing. And of course, if I go back to my airport example, if there is a Wi-Fi router there to which you connect with thousands and tens of thousands of people passing by every day, identifying what traffic is going through that device is not going to tell much more about anybody because there are too many devices using it. It goes also for tablets. If there is a shared tablet in a factory, which workers use to accomplish some task, what the tablet sends and receives doesn't tell us much about the factory traffic and the individual traffic. So those would be what we call shared service devices. They do provide activity in the sense of 802, IEEE, but they do not help any eavesdropper to identify traffic. So those concepts did not exist in IEEE. So we had to identify them and also conclude that that our job in the IEEE is not to define regulations, is not to define moral values, is to define technical solutions to technical problems. But we do recognize that we are inserted in a society and in a worldwide society that has a framework in which we can work. And that has a consequence in privacy, for example, where we understand that using the protocols we have designed to uniquely identifying a device or uniquely identifying a person may have consequences for that person's life. Good or bad, it's very contextual, but we are allowing it. And therefore, we must have an idea of if allowing it is necessary for our protocols, or if it's just a consequence of an oversight in the 1980s where those problems were not there yet. So what we were looking into was how we can assess if those privacy issues are exposed by our standards. And we also have to recognize that privacy in our standards doesn't mean forced anonymity. And I'm sure Rob will go on this topic in the next hour more extensively because it's a very adequate question. Collecting information about the activity of your device or collecting information about the activity of your tablet or phone through its protocol expression of communication may give information about you. It doesn't mean that we should suppress such identification. First of all, because in many cases it is not possible. If you need to communicate with that Wi-Fi router, the router needs to know who asks what. So there is a time where we need to have some identification of that device simply to be able to answer back to the person asking. But two, because privacy is being able to handle your data and being able to voluntarily decide if you want to share that data or not. It doesn't mean that we need to obfuscate or prevent you from emitting any data or prevent you from sharing any data. There are many cases where sharing data is very useful. For example, if you have a wristwatch that gives you some health information and you connect that to your phone, you may want to know, even if you're in a bus or on a train, that it's your watch talking to your phone and that you're not collecting information about your neighbor's watch. The same goes if you have a pacemaker that sends some pulses to a system on your watch or your phone that is then sent to your doctor. You want that information to be received and identified uniquely. So if there is a problem somewhere, your doctor can be alerted immediately. So you see, those communications are neutral in nature. They provide services for which some form of identification is sometimes needed. Our view in the 802E effort is to identify those, to help implementers, designers decide how much is needed, what can be shared, and how, so that when vendors, like your phone manufacturer, the phone or the iWatch manufacturer or the pacemaker manufacturer, design their product, they can, on one hand, decide what is necessary and what is useful and what is dangerous in their view as a manufacturer in terms of privacy exposure, but also provide you with that information so that you can make informed choices on what type of information you want to share, with whom, and what kind of information you do not want to share. So defining a framework where we can assess that possible exposure is primarily what we try to do in this 802E group. So what is particularly difficult is that the IEEE is a very large organization. Just in the 802 group, again, there are hundreds of engineers coming from all over the planet. Just in the 802.11, which is the Wi-Fi group, there are hundreds in the 802.3 and 802.1 group, which are the ones talking about this cabled communication, etc. So it's a very large organization that produce over time large sets of protocols and standards. Again, the Wi-Fi 802.11 standard is about 5,000 pages long that were designed across 20 years of effort to try to solve issues of the day, increase speed, increase security as well, and add features that were necessary for the proper communication. And among those, we find that in many cases, we send electric pulses that could be radio waves in their expression or can be carried inside a cable. We send light pulses. So those are what we call physical signals. And those, just by their design, by their nature, may be exposing specific characteristics. For example, the capability of your device is expressed by its ability to send a certain type of signal. And as the years go by, and you may have heard about Wi-Fi 6 and versus Wi-Fi 5, that means that there are new possibilities that emerge, and therefore new devices that express new capabilities. So just the expression of these capabilities is already a trace that some devices are going to express, showing that they can do things while some others cannot express those because they are older. And just by not expressing those, they are already expressing some particularities that allows an observer to separate devices into different groups and start looking at who is whom. And again, of course, it depends on your pool sample, right? If you have thousands of devices, it may not tell you much. In this panel, if somebody is sending a signal that says I'm Cisco capable, it's likely to be me. I'm the only one in that crowd. So this fingerprinting, as we call it, is very much dependent on the type of communication you're looking at. So right at the pulse level, right at the electric field level, there are already some expressions of capabilities. Then as these signals are sent back and forth, what we do is that we encode them in a way that represents zeros and ones. And in the structure where we work, those zeros and ones can mean a lot of things because they can express a lot of capabilities. For example, in Wi-Fi, there is some location capabilities by which if you have a map on your phone and you are in an open venue, you can send questions to the Wi-Fi routers around to say, how far am I from you? And the answer from those Wi-Fi routers can give you a sort of a read on your distance to these different points. And if they give to you their GPS location, then suddenly you can compute your own location compared to theirs and find your blue dot, where you are on that map. So you realize that you are trying to find your way to food court, but by doing this exchange, you are providing information about your location. And you see it's inherent in what you're trying to achieve. But of course, if we're going back to the idea of PII and PCI and uniquely identifying the device, as you trace your way in that venue, if you keep doing this kind of exchange unprotected, then it may be a very good occasion for somebody watching your exchanges to simply follow you in the crowd. So the procedures that are in the technical exchanges that we have, just by the sake of providing a service, tell me where I am or how far I am from you, and responding to that query allows an eavesdropper to provide, to have a view about what you're doing and obtain some form of PI and PCI. This is just an example, of course, but many services that you may be asking for, location being one, rely on that kind of idea where you're going to be expressing a capability or a need, and the infrastructure around is designed to be able to help you out answering that need. You could be, for example, in an airport trying to get a broadcast video about flight delays, for example. that is again a query you may be sending out to the infrastructure, and the infrastructure points closest to you, maybe responding, yes, I can send to you that broadcast. And you reading that broadcast as you move about in the airports, give again an observer a unique ability to follow what you're doing. And of course, Amelia was talking about web services, etc. And this gets very much into the IETF work, and we talk with them all the time. But we also realize just by the signal, just by the expression of that need at radio level, you can already be tracked, in your exchanges. So what can we do about it? Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because on one hand, we could do a clean table and say we have to redesign all the protocols from scratch now, and stop anything that doesn't protect privacy. This would be illusory for many reasons. One of them, as Amelia told you, is that this process takes time. And if I just take Wi-Fi as an example, it took 20 years to come to be what you have today. And that's again 5,000 pages. But the same goes for any of the 20 plus groups that work in the 802 organization. So that's altogether tens and tens of thousands of pages of protocols that were designed in days where privacy was not a concern because it was not exposed yet. So, stopping everything and redoing everything from scratch is probably not the best idea. What is probably a better idea is to do a few things. One of them is to, from now on, being aware of the privacy concern. Every time we design a new standard, every time we revise a standard that exists, look into that standard and try to assess what kind of privacy exposure was left or put in that standard without knowing it. But two, also being able to assess, the state of the standard today. And this is what 802 attempts to do. It tries to create a framework, and Amelia again was instrumental there, because we engineers can do technical solutions, but we cannot do it alone. We need some input into our work from people having a larger view of the framework, where this work matters, and where they think that our protocols can be involved. So there is a need, for people with that hybrid knowledge between regulatory on one side, and also moral and philosophy, because this is very much the field there. Policy, of course, but also technical knowledge to get into those forums and feed into us, the framework that we need to understand what are the consequences of the actions of those exchanges, and what we should do as a technical organization to address on the technical side those issues. And that's what 802 does. It provides a framework where we go into privacy concerns that we have identified in our standard, but also generally speaking in the industry. And we try to build on those concerns to look into what kind of privacy exposure can happen in an 802 standard. And as we do so, we come with few recommendations and a lot of questions that standard designers, that is to say people working in the 802 organization, can ask themselves as they're going to design new standard and revise existing standards. One of them is, what kind of a privacy exposure are you implying when you design this new service? And of course, today you have Wi-Fi 6. You have no doubt, of course, that Wi-Fi 7, Wi-Fi 8 will come up. We talked about Bluetooth. Bluetooth is in its generation 5 as well. And there are many other like BLE, like Zigbee, like Z-Wave, many other protocols that built upon all these standards. So as they keep evolving, having this P802E framework will help these designers of the future to look into their design, the new feature they are looking to propose, the new mechanisms they are looking to invent, and ask themselves, and ask themselves, what kind of consequence for privacy would that particular new feature have? It doesn't mean that they should then stop and say, oh, it may have some implication, we should not do it. Because there may be some cases where they will, by the way, but there may also be many other cases where they will just conclude, there is no possibility for us to provide this new feature that the world is asking us to design without necessarily providing some form of identification. So that means that we cannot prevent some partial exposure. But then the question they will ask themselves is, first, do we need this feature? Is it required? And if it is, are there ways for us to mitigate that exposure? And it could go, in multiple ways, and those ways are likely to be, evolving as the industry and the technology will evolve as well. Some of them could be to make sure that the exposure is temporal. You only expose, your device name, or we call it a MAC address, and we'll come back on that in the next hour, for just the time you need to obtain the service. And as soon as you have it, you change it or you hide it. Or, we find another way to ask for this service, where instead of you asking the question, the AP or the router or any device you connect to may anticipate that somebody may be asking the question and already offer an answer so that your privacy can be respected. We were talking about location before. One of example of this implementation is a change in a new location protocol, again with Wi-Fi, where instead of you asking to an access point how far I am from you, working on these PI22E recommendations, we design a new way where those Wi-Fi routers are simply going to exchange ranging messages among each other. And you, with your phone, are just going to be listening to those exchanges. And by just hearing those exchanges, by these things over the ceiling, you're going to deduce your own distance to those by just, phenomenon about the, speed of light and a signal traffic speed. So you see, you can be then now in an airport with your phone and the blue dot on your phone without sending anything. You're not sending any signal out, you're just listening. So with this PA22E, it helps those designers when they design those features, think for a minute and say, do we really need this feature? Is there a way we can redesign this feature so that it does not expose privacy? And if we find that way, let's find this better way. But also if there are some ways that are left where there are some identifiers that are necessary, if there is some exposure that is necessary for the service, then we should document that. We should at least be aware of it and document it. So create a clause, as we call it, or an annex somewhere in those standards, say, for all these, we could not find a solution where there is no, exposure of identity because the station needs to ask. The client needs to be identified so we can answer the right question to the right person. Beware, those are left here. And this is useful for people who implement and vendors, your phone maker, your Wi-Fi router manufacturer, so that they can decide and assess if these are left and if they want to implement those or if they can just go without. And if they want to implement those, at least they will, and they will tell you. So when you receive this equipment, you will be able to say, in order to enable those features that you may or may not want, then there will be necessary an exposure of dialogue. That will mean that there may be some privacy exposure, some PII exposure. And having known that, you can decide if this service is something you need or something you can, just not adopt. So that will help those implementers as well, and new adopter of that technology, to have this privacy awareness. And of course, this is for new protocols. The same goes as we'll be combing back into all these existing standards. Again, more than 40 years in the 802 that was created in 1980. For 40 years of standards, that's a lot of standards. Some of them are merely obsolete now. They are being replaced by newer ones, and that's good because that's as much less to look at. But some of them are still very, very much active. So as we go into what we call revision standards, and we are in revision 4, 5, 6, depending on the standard, we can look back into those with the framework of 802E and comb through and say, what was the intent back then when this feature was designed? Is there a way for us to look at this feature again with another look? Should we replace it entirely? If we replace it, of course, it's complicated because that means that some devices will not work anymore with this new feature. So there's a lot of complexity there, but can we find a way to limit the complexity, replace the feature, and better protect privacy? So that will help us, reassess those standards and find if there are ways for us to improve them. So, this 802E is an interesting example because you see, it's not something that addresses privacy directly in one specific protocol by providing technical solution for that one protocol. What it does is provide a framework where we want this community of engineers from all over the planet, every time they work on a standard, think privacy. ask themselves about privacy exposure and try to find better ways to develop the same features that the world wants without this privacy exposure. However, and for as a conclusion, and as Amelia was exposing, we cannot do it alone. We need input, and we need input from everybody, from consumers, of course, from manufacturers, because the big question is there an ask? Essentially, those protocols we design are here so that a system can provide a service to another system requesting this service. Can it be done without privacy exposure? Maybe in some cases, maybe not in some others, but who wants it? It's more complicated, of course, to design something that is going to allow you to get a great feature without exposing anything. So it's more complicated, and the question is there a demand? Is there a demand from device implementers? Well, it depends if they have a demand from their customers. So it goes back into this question about first, the regulatory bodies all around the planet trying to provide a framework, a policy framework around what is good and what is not good in terms of privacy exposure. It takes, of course, thinkers, philosophers and policy thinkers, public policy thinkers, to think around this problem and say, is this something that we as a country, we as a civilization want to protect? And if so, that feedback is crucial for organizations like ours, so that we can get this guidance into designing what kind of technical solutions and technical compromise really we can make to design features, as efficient as possible within the moral context that you think we should be abiding upon. Let me stop there. I see that there were a lot of questions in the panel, so maybe I should stop there.
Thank you, Jerome. It's fascinating. And of course, this presentation is a great example of the horizontal exchange between IEEE and IETF. I heard you talk a lot about metadata, data about data. Of course, this creates many possible privacy threats like network effects and location patterns. Before we jump into the demand question with the panelists, I want to address a question that Gabriel put in the chat, and you may be able to answer that question, or maybe Amelia could jump in as well. The question reads, policy bodies can guide standards such as frequencies for mobile transmission. However, most adopted standards come from industry interests, which in this context of data and data value applies to Google and Facebook, who develop their own standards. How are policy setters to deal with this split?
So Amelia, you want to take the policy side and I'll take the technical side?
Yeah. Google is certainly very active in a large range of open industry-driven standards communities, notably the Internet Engineering Task Force, but also places like World Wide Web Consortium. And so the way that policy setters can deal with, different companies being in different industry-driven standards bodies is, I guess, to have a holistic view of the technical architectures they're building and ensuring that for the services that they procure, they're putting in the right references to the right standards from the multitude of industry-driven standards bodies that are out there. So I guess this is how I would encourage dealing with the split. Create interfaces with industry-driven standards bodies and then make the appropriate demands from the appropriate standards body. But maybe I hope that we'll come back to this with some of our data protection authority representatives later.
Yes,
right.
Thank you. And it's very true that in those bodies, IEEE, IETF, there are a lot of engineers who represent themselves and a lot of engineers who represent corporations, organizations. Facebook is one, of course, Google is another one, Apple, etc. In the end, as we design standards, the question is, are these of interest to implementers? And those are those vendors that you were referring to. And of course, the question is, do they have any pressure to adopt those standards? And most of the time, the answer is yes, if there is diversity. If there are multiple vendors of phones in an airport, well, the wireless infrastructure there better be able to talk to all of them. So that forces a common set of features. If there is one dominant player, it may be easier for that player to force their protocols. But the world is a big place. And although there are big names out there, it's a big place. So most times, common standards are more efficient in the long run for those big players than proprietary features, and they know that.
Thank you. We have two more questions from Hector. First one, are there standards differentiating the device type and purpose, for instance, medical devices or connected vehicles, which may have very specific needs for privacy protection different to a mobile phone or a Bluetooth device, for instance?
That's a fascinating question, because the answer is yes, but no, but yes, a little bit. Because what you're describing is context. And essentially, when your phone communicates with your home Wi-Fi router, it's the same thing when the RMI portable machine in a hospital talk to the Wi-Fi router there. The protocol itself is the same. So in the early days of 802, the answer was no. But as time went on, we designed more and more what we call use cases. That is to say, environments where a certain type of exchange would make sense, technically speaking, whereas in another one it would not. And that caused us to differentiate those different types of environments in the use cases. It doesn't mean that the protocols are different. In many cases, the same protocol can be used in many different use cases and therefore different environments. But there are some specifics where a specific environment type of device will ask questions that another one will not. So there is a common ground, and then there are some twinkling of specifics around the context. But I say it's fascinating because it's early, it's new for us. 20 years ago, my answer would have been a flat no. 10 years ago, I would have said, we're thinking around this. Today, I say, yeah, we have some of that, and it's becoming more and more prevalent.
Well, the second question is a little bit more generic, and I'm going to rephrase it within the context of IEEE and IETF. Could you comment on the role of AI within the context of big data, data aggregators, and the emergence of new privacy risks due to AI? So basically, this is a question about, is there any standardization that could help us bottom up in this new fascinating context?
Yes, and it's of course a booming research, right, and industry as well. We are aware at the IEEE that there are machine learning and AI techniques that can do fingerprinting. They can do more too. There are protocols not in the 802 group, but the IEEE at large that are looking for machine learning in a way to provide better service by anticipating what your station may be needing, so that again this Wi-Fi router can offer the service before you ask. That means that we need to have a certain level of trust between the station and the infrastructure, or that the infrastructure is generic enough, an airport, for example, to know what average device would need there. So in the 802 group, that notion doesn't exist because we designed those low-layer protocols. But in the IEEE at large, yes, machine learning starts being looked at more and more, including in the context of privacy, to define methods by which we can obfuscate in a more efficient way, and today we would even say quantum way, the identifications, so that it makes the job of the bad guys more and more difficult.
Great. Well, to be considerate of everyone's time and attention, we thought it would be a good idea to have a very short break. We'll shorten it to like 3 minutes to give everybody time to refill their cup of coffee or to make a short bio stop. Before we then continue with a short presentation by Marit Hansen, and actually the first of 3 sets of questions that we have lined up for you in the discussion part, for the second part of this webinar. So with having all said that, we will be back at 5:08 on Central European time. So back in 3 minutes. Privacy preserving network technologies. And what are the issues around the speed to market and how to address these effectively? And to help us kick off this discussion, I'll invite Marit with a short presentation, and then others to comment on this discussion. Floor is yours, Marit.
Thank you very much. I try to be clear, just a moment. So you should see now slides, right?
Fantastic, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Marit Hansen. I'm the Data Protection Commissioner of Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, and we are in some kinds participating in several standardization initiatives, although I agree that it's hard work, much work, different work from our normal tasks. So never underestimate standardization work. On the other hand, also never underestimate the effect of standardization work. And we had some work done in the Wi-Fi access point scenario. What you heard from Jerome was mainly the idea of the access points of some controllers, some organizations, and then the users and how to deal with that with the user devices, and that there are some technologies, some techniques that are better for privacy. We have now another idea which has to be considered in what we have been doing here all webinar now, a kind of impact assessment, so risk assessments, thinking of the effects. And this means we see the world is changing, that not only people are users and then there are the organizations with the access points, but ordinary people, users, are access points themselves, or the devices are access points. And especially this is happening in the car, in the vehicle, not only because it's a connected car, also already because of infotainment, entertainment, internet connectivity, and other stuff that is typical now also in nowadays cars. And the Wi-Fi identifiers are usually unique and characterizing.
Marit,
the access
before
points.
you move on, Marit,
Yeah?
we only see half of your slides, so maybe we can adjust the projection before we continue, because they're
Just a
really
moment.
informative.
Okay, can you do something, or should I do something? Okay. Is it
Maybe-
better now? Is it better?
Yes, now I see the whole slide.
Okay,
now
interesting.
I only see
Okay,
half of
so
it. Now
let's.
it's back to half the slide only.
Ooh. Okay, just a moment. Perhaps. Is it now better?
Almost, like we have now 90%, so we need to shift it a little bit more. Yes.
What about
This is
now?
perfect. Now we see everything. Yes.
Okay, so in the bottom line, it's only our name. So if you don't see that, but okay, let's go on. It's a very few slides. Only think of Wi-Fi identifiers usually are unique and never change. And this is of course a privacy risk if this information can be linked. And what we see now is that the access points are tracked or are logged, for example, because of navigation, because of maps, which is also quite typical also for example, navigation services you want to make use of. But what we also see that usually there's no distinction, that it's not being distinguished whether this is now a fixed access point by an airport or by a telco provider, or whether it's the users, for example, with the cars. And we see everybody is listening and everybody is sending, but which also means that the tracking scenario can be much larger than before. So nothing like the 90s or perhaps 10 years ago, but something which will happen. And now a very short idea, perhaps not the best one. Let's just discuss it then later on, not necessarily here in the webinar. Of course, how to solve it now. We could configure some kind of very complicated consent management. Giving consent is something from the data protection people. Are you willing to be tracked? Are you willing that this information that is available in the air that everybody could pick, is this something where you also need some infrastructure putting in some consent, which is quite complicated and context-based and not so easy to. We have now a very small proposal for a solution. We see the MAC addresses and their structure, and there's something which may help, at least in the short term, if we have no possibility to start from scratch, that we can use this bit of locally administered MAC address. And then all those collectors of these addresses could at least distinguish or select whether they want to do that or not. This could be checked, of course, by DPAs. It could, of course, also be misused, but then you will misuse it and do it on purpose. Like what Jerome said, of course, all information could be used in different ways, which is not foreseen, but then it's clear that there may be other ways to prove it, to find out if there's a misbehavior, and very many controllers don't want to misbehave, but they want to comply. If you want to read more about that, there's this URL with a complete report we did in the car project, therefore, which was not discussed. But what I want to show now, no slide anymore, is the idea of, we see now a demand because the world has changed. And of course, standardization initiatives often cannot do this kind of impact assessment, also because the context, and therefore I like this question very much, the context often is not known, and it shouldn't be playing a valid role in when designing an infrastructure. There shouldn't be so many different infrastructures per context. But for some devices or for some extra information, we need some coding, I think, to express whether we have now a medical device or other stuff. So I think this is a quite good idea to now evolve and develop the standards quite further. Now the question from Rob was on the demand side. Who is demanding? Of course, we as a data protection commissioners, we can demand a lot. On the other hand, is this now how it works? Probably not so much, but we see many controllers, many processors want to do the right thing. And for the public service, they have to do the right thing. And this means for procurement, I see they have to consider also the idea of data protection by design and by default. And I see more and more standards offering, at least if you demanded, a better solution, or you can configure it in a way. And also because the risks are now they're clearer than perhaps 10 or 20 years ago, but of course also because we already experienced security disasters and privacy disasters, and therefore we have more feeling and better ways to communicate the risks. So I think we need milestones in the development process where it's clear that you can only go on if you have already considered how to solve some problems, or whether you need some different ways, speaking of identifiers, linkage of identifiers, what is processed locally, what is processed centrally, and so on. There may be good ideas. For example, with the Corona warning app, we were quite happy that the changing identifiers were part of the concept. We have been telling about changing identifiers for, well, decades, I think, but now it has been done because we needed for the Corona situation a trustworthy and not so much to be criticized solution. And then many cooperation parts are going in the privacy way and not the other way around. So I'm not so unhappy with the trends right now. But we also see that still, and this is what I relate with the media, if we think of accessibility and how long it took to make, and we are not there yet, to make websites accessible, that we need also some evaluation, some, for example, also awards. We said we have seen so many awards being given to non-privacy compliant websites or non-accessible websites, but this should be a mandatory criteria also for funding authorities or agencies. And therefore, if the demand is there, then it's easier to at least have this as an option to be offered and to be asked for. And otherwise it will stay a hen and egg problem and nobody will move. Right now, I think there is a kind of good movement, although I cannot promise that in 2 years' time or so, everything will be solved. So much for my 2 minutes right now.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the slides. I mean, it is a complex topic, specifically because we have also people watching this webinar that come from a legal background. And well, if Jerome simplifies it to zeros and ones, that's of course a lot of oversimplification. So these graphics really, really help. So thank you very much. Tiago, maybe a first response from you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. Let me have the chance to thank you to you and to the Future of Privacy Forum for the invitation. Great presentations from Amelia, Jerome, and Merit. Thank you as well. So representing the Wireless Broadband Alliance, first of all, I would like to share that definitely the demand is there. We see not only from all of us as users, but representing the WBA, the Wireless Broadband Alliance, many of our members, the service providers, the operators, they see the importance of implementing privacy policies through the different services that they have. And I see as well, I interact with many regulators, policymakers. I see the demand as well coming very strongly. One of the topics that I would like to share today, and maybe I can share more details further, is some of our work on the public Wi-Fi services, the work that the Alliance has been developing on concepts of how to connect Wi-Fi and guarantee a privacy mechanism. I can talk more about that, but I think one key element is really to find that fine balance between the information that is shared, all of us as users, and the information that someone receives it and is going to act on that. So Jerome gave a few examples where it's very useful to share our personal data. So I can get, for example, alerts on emergencies services, or I can get some alerts of something that may impact my day-to-day. So that's good. But at the same time, like Merit said, it's very important to have a way to avoid the misbehaviors. And in WBA, as I share some of our work on harmonizing some services, we have been pushing for policies that somehow they define a baseline of a policy that everyone must agree on. And anyone that wants to go beyond that baseline, they need to have additional agreements with the end user or a specific service.
Thank you very much. A short reaction from you, Amelia.
I could not hear the last thing.
I thought you wanted to respond as well to the first questions put forward by Marit.
So I thought Marit's presentation was very interesting, especially in light of a lot of the work that I was doing, engineers at the 802.11 between 2017 and 2019, because exactly this thing with permanent identifiers is something that a lot of engineers have been thinking about a lot, and that they're continuing to think about in the context of internet technologies, but also mobile network technologies. And so for specifically automotive use cases, there is a large corpus of work that goes back to 2005, which I had the pleasure of exploring when I was doing a human rights review on IETF drafts in a working group called IP Wave that is trying to adapt vehicular communications technologies to new types of internet protocol addressing. And so in the .11 group that does Wi-Fi broadly, there's also a number of discussions on geolocational privacy and how can you sort this with different types of exchanges, how to design a next generation vehicle technologies. One particular challenge, which as far as I understand from the standards bodies where I have been, which are all of them non-governmental, by the way, is how do you deal with certificate management when you need to encrypt data in some transactions? So how do you create an adequate trust chain for authenticated communications when this is needed in vehicular environments? And there's a great presentation from an Internet Engineering Task Force academic event in, I think, 2018 that specifically speaks to this point. yeah, so there's a lot of work that has been done with vehicular communications in particular.
Jerome, specifically on the question on the speed to market, could you maybe help us with the challenges there or maybe the possible angles of improvement?
Yeah, this is a very interesting case that Merit is raising because, of course, when this case was designed in 2006, our idea was you want to connect to your car, right? Of course, you don't want to have your phone that jumps to the next car when you're at a red light, and then of course you lose that connection because car moves away. That doesn't work. So we have to make sure that identifiers are robustly strong and all the time the same, so you can connect to your car, not to the others. And of course, if you were to change the identifiers, well, next morning you walk into your car, the car doesn't know you anymore because identifiers have changed. So that was, the idea in 2006. Today, with privacy in mind, we say, well, no, as Amelia says, we can maybe design this thing differently. Do a sort of secret handshake that you and your car do. And that makes that by just showing that you know the handshake, you don't really need to identify yourself anymore. So the handshake itself is a sort of clue that's enough. So we designed that. But then, of course, as you say, Rob, the question is now you have cars that have the old technique. And we say, well, we have this new technique. Is your phone compatible? Is the car compatible? How long does it take for the car manufacturers in the life cycle of a car, which may be 5 years in some cases, 10 or 15 years in some others, to implement those? Is there a way for us to help those adopt these technologies by providing a sort of a virtual update, software update, which means our car itself needs to be connected to get some download of new features it didn't have before. So all this is not only a technical challenge, it's also an industry challenge. Is the industry ready to embrace this new feature? And what is the demand that is enough for them to say, I'm going to accept that the older system will not work anymore? So that path to market is where very often the technology side, once the problem is solved, stumbles a little bit.
Thank you very much. I think it's a great moment to move on to the second question. And for the second question, I will invite Jelena Bonik to kickstart the discussion. The question reads, what are the benefits of certification and standardization in the WLAN space? The floor is yours, Jelena.
Thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's also great to be here and to kind of try to also provide my view or the view of the data from the Data Protection Authority's view on these things. So what I was thinking now that I've been listening to all the interesting presentations was that my intervention will be more well, we'll kind of be answering the question of whether there is a demand for privacy preserving standards. And from the European perspective, from the perspective of the European legislation, there is a clear demand in the cases where structures and Wi-Fi tracking, when it involves processing personal data, so the data that is linked to an identifiable person, these data constitute personal data according to the legal regime, and which means that any such processing by anyone doing it, so be it a hospital or airport or any application, would need to respect the General Data Protection Regulation. And it includes quite specific rules about legal basis, which means that no data processing is allowed if there is no legal ground for it. And the legal grounds for it are, for example, consent of the individual, or in the case of, let's say, smart cities applications, which are managed by cities, so the public sector, such legal basis would have to be in a certain law, for example. So in this sense, I think that in the European environment, the GDPR is quite a big demand, and it should drive demand for standards that is privacy enhancing, in the sense that it could contribute to building compliance with the rule. And all these providers of smart infrastructure need to be able to demonstrate that they comply with the rules. And additionally, could help kind of filling basically the legal provisions, which are quite vague and wide. So for example, we have a legal provision in the GDPR, which says that the data controllers need to respect privacy by design, data protection by design. This means that basically any technical solution, for example, in a smart city, should be designed in such a way that it is privacy, data protection enhancing, which means data minimization, which means all these types of sort of things. But on the other hand, the provision is quite vague. So what we see markets at the data controllers is that they need help, they need assistance in how they achieve this data protection by design in a specific field, because these can be quite technical questions, as was seen also from the presentations before me. And connecting to all these questions, I think that standardization, technical standardization, can be a very important and valid tool for building compliance and also for helping to achieve kind of common knowledge and common understanding about what is state of the art in technical kind of in the way technical solutions are designed to be privacy protecting. And what I would also like to point out here is that, at least in the European space, since this demand is kind of from the legislation which exists here, but I know that not also in such a way in the rest of the world, it is also very important to keep in mind the data protection authorities and the data protection experts when the standards that are focusing also on privacy issues are being developed, because these experts be in the end those that will be assessing a standard, whether it really does what it is supposed to do in the sense of data protection rules. So including these types of experts and persons in the process of building a standard, whether it's an international, national one, or whichever one, I think it's very important to guarantee acceptance of this standard, because in the end, the data protection authorities, when they are assessing compliance of someone, let's say providing a smart city infrastructure, the protection authority will be able to use this, somebody is adhering to a certain standard in a very positive way, even when doing a supervision, for example. If the standard is built in such a way that the criteria and that the requirements are accessible, are transparent, the authority checking compliance will be able to use this and to build knowledge. And also what I would like to point out, what is important is also the way that adherence to the standard is kind of checked. So whether this is a certification scheme, a certification body that is assessing adherence to the standard, this whole process of checking whether someone is doing their data processing in relation to a standard is very important. The transparency of this process, how the checks are done, whether it's an on-site audit, whether it's just checking the documentation. These are all very important questions when to answer basically a question of, is someone on the market really respecting what the standard is saying? So both what the standard is saying should be, at least in Europe, kind of strive to be compliant with the law. And also this process of checking compliance with the standard should be of such kind and quality that it would be able, that someone would be able to say with a certain degree of certainty that a provider of a technical solution is doing what it should be doing according to the standard, and how this relates to the law. I hope this was clear.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think this is a great bridge as well to Udo Uhlen, who has been in his former role at the Dutch Data Protection Authorities and very familiar with the application of standards by data controllers. But now, more interestingly, in his new role, has already had experience with implementing Wi-Fi technology. Udo, I would first of all very happy to have you here, but also we would like to learn about what are the challenges, and maybe you can take us a little bit into the context that you were actually implementing the technologies and the privacy by design questions that came on your desk, to say it shortly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rob, for asking me to attend this this webinar. It's great to hear all the views until now. Yes, I work now for the Dutch Railways, and the Dutch Railways also explore rail stations, and on some rail stations it can be, well, not at this moment anymore, but before COVID-19 it could be very busy on the rail stations. So Dutch Railways faces all issues around crowd management, because safety of our travelers is very important. So on the way to explore solutions to handle the crowd management, there was also the question, what kinds of data processing can we use to control the crowd, to act quickly when it's too busy on a certain place in the station or whatever. And several types of data processing were explored. It started in the early days with counting by people itself. After that, there were, in Holland, you have to check in and check out before you can travel by train. It's a system. It also collects data on how many people are in a certain railway station and also in a certain train. And at a moment, there was also the option of using Wi-Fi tracking and Bluetooth tracking on certain railway stations to process data for the purpose of crowd control on the railway station. And the idea was to do it on a method that is not privacy intrusive. Well, first of all, and other also mentioned it also, when you do it in Europe, you have to have a legal ground according to the GDPR. Well, Dutch Railways choose to process this data on the legal ground, the legitimate interest. So Dutch Railways has an interest for process data in order to make sure that our travelers can be safe in trains, can be safe in the railway stations. And if you have that interest, then you have to assess the question, okay, but what kind of type of process of data can I use, and is that really necessary to process that kind of data? And what measures do you take to make sure that the privacy of our travelers does not gets too much invaded in relation to the interests of the Dutch Railways. So we have implemented a system of Wi-Fi tracking, which sees only those railway stations where it's really necessary to use that method. So other methods doesn't work. And we have implemented some measures that make sure that we can see in a certain day, how someone, and we don't know who it is, but how someone can commute over a railway station, but we don't know who it is. Because we hash the MAC address on the sensor in the railway station, and then it will be sent to the server, a central server, where it's getting another hash, and then we bring it to a certain traveling number, and the traveling number is the same for all the sensors in that railway station, so we can collect the patterns a person is going through the railway station, but it's only available for 1 day for a Dutch Railways days, which end at 4 o'clock in the morning and started at 4 o'clock in the morning again. So we only know the patterns of that MAC address for that traveler for 1 day, and after that we destroy it. I think what is important that the measures by hashing it once and hashing it twice, so it's quite difficult to count it back to the original MAC address. And second, what is important, that we don't do the data collection over the days. So it is only restricted to 1 day and not a collection of data over time. We inform, of course, about the fact that we do on Wi-Fi tracking. We inform, of course, in our privacy statement, but we also inform on the railway stations itself. And I think, Rob, what it's very important, it's to question about the necessity. Is it really necessary to collect the data? And is it really necessary to use Wi-Fi tracking? Because, well, when you invited me for this panel and specific about this business case, we were discussing the necessity about using Wi-Fi tracking on the railway stations. And I think at this moment there are some people going around on railway stations to get the stickers away, because we stopped with Wi-Fi tracking because of the fact that it's at this moment we don't need the data anymore, because there are less people on the railway stations, and we have also all the data that we can use for our models and also for the crowd control. Use only the data, and it's also a recommendation I can give to all of them. Only use data what you really need, and not because you once started with it, then you keep collecting data forever. So stop it when you don't need it anymore.
Fantastic. It's great to hear that not just the privacy principles have been applied in your use case, starting with necessity and proportionality, but also taking into account data retention, for example, but privacy by design with a double hashing solution. As a first response, I want to ask Kelsey, because she is also working in the smart city context, to have like a first response. Kelsey, please.
Yeah, so thanks. I think that was a really helpful overview, Udo. I'm really excited to hear about some of those best practices. As Rob was saying, I work a lot with cities, particularly in the US and Canada, on their use of smart city technologies and sort of increase access to connected technologies in a variety of public spaces. And it's always, I think, a challenge, particularly when you're in a regime that doesn't have a clear legal standard that has to be met for what to collect. Think about those contextual questions, to think about what really is necessary. What's the particular use case? What's the value of this technology? What kind of insights are you trying to gain? And are there alternative mechanisms that might get you that same information with less privacy, trade-offs? But it's also, I think, an interesting example. So one of the stories that comes to mind is actually the city of Seattle, where I live and have worked with often. A number of years ago, they rolled out a wireless mesh network that was meant to increase communications for emergency services personnel in case of a natural disaster or some other kind of an event. that was meant to potentially support security, but it had a variety of purposes. It wasn't entirely clear in the communications and in potentially some of the marketing materials what it's used for. There wasn't a lot of notice that went up around. So Amelia, to your earlier points around transparency and the ability to opt out and sort of foreseeability, I think. And ultimately what ended up happening was that there was a severe public backlash to the sudden introduction of physical devices, particularly in connectivity devices in public spaces. And the city ended up having to, pay another $150,000 to remove all of the devices in the end and to see other ways to use them or to try to gain that same sort of insight. And I think, in large part, one of the takeaways that, I've seen from that kind of experience and in other cities around the world is sort of the need to not just have really strong and robust privacy by design safeguards and really strong technical safeguards, but to be able to engage with the public on them, to be able to help make people aware of what that means, and to be able to explain how these technical and safeguards, are working to protect individuals. That if you're not able to communicate that in a way that is understandable, and this is of course a very technical topic, so sometimes hard to get that message across in this clear way, for the lay person. But if you're not able to bridge that gap, you're often still going to be left with the trust deficit. Even if you're doing everything right, if you can't convince people that you are doing that, you're taking these best practices into account, you may still end up with perception problems. You still may end up with people changing their behaviors because they're afraid of surveillance, even if it isn't being actualized in the way that they think it is. And so just to, I think, really, think through and help have real clarity on what are those use cases, what is that necessity and proportionality, and to be able to articulate that. It's not just to have that internally, but to be able to share that back to the public. And perhaps one of the challenges is that because these things are being developed at the standards level, there's not a lot of room for, and I think rightly, not a lot of room for local, adaptation. We don't want every city to have a slightly different technical standard on the space, but that also removes some of the opportunities for public engagement and for the local community to have a voice in what kinds of safeguards they feel the most comfortable with. So thinking through ways to, engage a lot of different folks and a lot of diverse communities in the development process, and then particularly in the implementation process, I think goes a really long way. So just to back up all of the great things that fellow panelists have been saying, and happy to continue the conversation from here. Thanks, Rob.
Fantastic. I think that this conversation is moving slowly forward as well, and I hope we can make that final step towards recommendations. And of course, there are many topics we did not touch upon. So I propose to do like a short to the table, because I asked the panelists to prepare 1 or 2 recommendations, but I also want to ask them to be mindful of time as well. And the row order that we will do the tour de table in will be first Tiago, then Jelena, and then Jerome, and then Marit, then Udo, and Amelia will have the final word. So first to you, Tiago, what could be the role of procurement in the development and deployment of privacy-friendly technologies, or other recommendations that you may have?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. So I will come from an angle of public Wi-Fi access services. So definitely standardization is a key element. I can share that in the Wireless Broadband Alliance, we are developing a roaming federation for public Wi-Fi services that is called Open Roaming. And this federation, it touches on several topics that were mentioned here before. So we need to bring that concept of there are common policies that if you want to be part of that federation, you need to follow. And with that, we want to harmonize the experience for all of us as users. So the last thing that I believe, at least myself as a user, I don't want to go to a train station and I have one set of experience. Then I go to a city, I have a completely different experience. I go to a coffee shop, it's completely different experience. So we need some level of harmonization that we as the users, we feel as well that we are safeguarded somehow. And I want to bring 2 concepts. One was mentioned by Emilia. So it's very important that there is an handshake between the network and the device, or the user that is behind that device. So that's very important to guarantee the security level. And the other element is about trusted parties. Once more, when we develop this open roaming federation, it's really to bring some level of trusted environment for anyone that wants to connect to a public Wi-Fi network. That will bring that additional level of trust. We believe as well, one of the questions that you mentioned before, the context is very important. And in the Federation, we have been discussing that depending on the context, you may have different privacy policies. And if the different players that are part of a specific context or a specific vertical, they need to agree and expose in a very transparent way to their users that for that specific vertical, there is a set of privacy policy that needs to be implemented to maximize the services, the innovation, and the benefits to the end user. So that's another element very critical as well. Our Federation Open Roaming, it focuses a lot on the short term and what we can do today. But at the same time, we are very supportive of initiatives and collaboration with IEEE and other industry bodies that we need as well to think ahead. So, but for the short term, definitely standardization, and from our case, we have been driving open roaming as a standard and a federation to make us all of us safer when we connect to public Wi-Fi.
Thank you. Jelena, what recommendation do you have for us, taking into account the discussion of today?
So, as I said before, a standard is meant to use EU. I would recommend that in the development of the standard, it is explored to what extent it fits into the EU legal framework of the GDPR, because it has very specific rules. It has very specific definitions of what we understand as personal data, and it is being enforced by the data protection authorities. And when we connect it to the procurement procedures, the public sector that would be in the procurement procedures, they would also have to be looking at things applied with GDPR. So this is a big, I think that's a big topic, but I also think that it is sometimes hard to come close to quite high stats that are basically prescribed in the EU. So this would be my recommendation, to search for synergies, strive to achieve, or at least search for compliance with the European rules.
So Jerome, to some extent, you've received a lot of feedback on the presentation and the standards that impression that you've given and the standards that you are developing. Your recommendation, please.
Engage with us. If you are in the public sector, engage with us. You know, there are, you know, these conversations are very, very technical, but most of the mailing lists are open. So, and they are very open for input. So anyone, if you're in the public sector, can go into this list and express needs. As I have only 1 minute, I'll tell you a very short story. Here in the US, in the South, there was a middle school where they were having some location services for devices, initially for teachers, but then they started tracking kids' phones, and it's middle school, so these kids are 8 to 12 years old. And because there is no regulation, no framework, some teachers asked the parents if they were okay if we track their kids, and some say, oh my God, no, you're not going to be 1994. Some others said yes. And then there was an active shooter in the school. And when the first responders came on site, they used location tracking system to see the MAC address fleeing away from a path. So that allowed them to know where the bad guy is and take him down, but also find the kids who were hiding. So is it good to track devices or not? We at the IEEE cannot know that. We need that input from the regulation authorities, from the procurement public servants to tell us what we do. And if you are in the general public listening to this podcast, engage. Help define what it means to be what is privacy for you, what it means for you, so we can receive that guidance and design the protocols around that.
Thank you very much. Marit, what recommendation would you like to put forward?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think everybody was already telling some parts that are right on the spot. We need the broad way of thinking, interconnected thinking, not only for one specific standard or one specific technology. Think more in a way of scenarios, use cases with context, impact assessment. And I totally understand that not everybody is used to that, and therefore we need to bridge the gap between the policy people and the perhaps technology or industry standardization initiatives. But we also need ways to express what is being done, because it's not one size fits all, and standardization cannot do everything. So it's as the same as with regulation. So it's not on its own the solution, not one size fits all. We need the way of thinking in parameters, in how to configure, how to express and document and make sure to implement the right parameters, that there's a choice. Even privacy or data protection is not one scenario, as we heard. Sometimes we want access and availability, sometimes we may prevent that. And therefore, we also think again, then thinking back in the technology perspective, what modules can we use? Having the same terminology, know what we are talking about, and then it's much easier. And of course, we're willing to contribute.
Thank you. Yeah, having the same terminology obviously helps. If we dive into concepts like what is privacy and what is personally identifiable information, you really see it's crucial that we start with a good understanding, a common understanding of what we're talking about. Udo, I'd like to invite you as well to add some recommendations to the discussion, please.
Well, first, what I already told and what all other participants also recommended, use privacy by design. And if you want to use an application by a vendor or something like that, well, I think it's important when you go to the market that you have defined your own privacy standards and your own security standards. That is also part of the selection process when you select the specific vendor. And so don't only look at the price or the blue eyes of the vendor, but also define before you go to the market which privacy and security standards the application or the machine you want to use have to meet.
So follow-up question there is, did you actually have choice between vendors, or was there for your context only one vendor that was very obvious?
For this specific processing, I think there was not very much choice, but it was a more general recommendation because, well, Dutch Railways is a big company, and we have lots of data processing, so we use lots of vendors. So it's a recommendation that is more broad than only for Wi-Fi tracking. But on another specific case where we are also looking at Wi-Fi tracking, there we have indeed a choice, and then privacy and security is also an important part of the selection of vendor. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you much for sharing that. Amelia, the closing recommendation for you in this tour de table.
I think I'm going to do a cop-out and say that I endorse all of the previously mentioned recommendations and just leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. We are almost on top of the hour. I think it was a fascinating 2 hours. The time went very quickly. We are going to wrap up. I'm going to thank our speakers. Thank you, Thiago. Thank you, Jelena. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Marit. But also you, Udo, and specifically to you, Amelia, to reaching out again and having the opportunity to work with you once more. At FBF, Kelsey and I will start processing the recording, and we will work on a blog post. We'll reach out to you to see if we can share the slides as well. And if any of you who attended the webinar or are looking at a moment that is more convenient, then please, if you have questions, do not reach out to us. Thank you very much so far. And with that, I would like to conclude the webinar and wish you all a very nice day. Bye-bye.